Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Science Delivery Project PIs, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on conservation for sage-grouse and approaches for prioritizing management, presented by Steve Knick from the USGS. Before we begin, I would like to let you know that our final webinar of the season will be on vegetation resistance and resilience issues presented by Jean Chambers. This webinar will be held sometime during the middle of next month, and I will send an announcement to our listserv when the date is set. If you have questions during the presentation today, you may type them in the question box at any time. I will field questions to Steve Knick after his presentation. Steve will have a live audience in Idaho as well, so we'll go back and forth between webinar questions and in-person questions. But Steve will repeat the questions from his in-person group so that you guys can hear what the questions are. If you have questions specific to me, I can type responses during the presentation at any time. Wednesday, the GoToWebinar system will automatically send you a link to the recording of this webinar, and I will also post it on our webpage. Please feel free to email or call me anytime with additional questions or comments. I would now like to introduce our presenter today. Steve Knick is a research ecologist at the USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center, who has worked in sagebrush systems in the western United States for over 25 years. His research has focused on the role of human and natural disturbance in shaping ecological systems, the effects of multi-scale habitat characteristics on passerine bird communities, and the use of GIS techniques and satellite imagery to characterize landscapes in semi-arid regions. He was a lead scientist providing information for 2 listing decisions by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on greater sage-grouse. He's an editor and author of the forthcoming book, Greater Sage-Grouse, Ecology and Conservation of a Landscape Species and Its Habitat, that will be published this spring by the University of California Press as a volume in the series Studies in Avian Biology. Welcome, Steve, and thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you. I was thinking earlier this morning about how fortunate we are for those of us who have the opportunity to study sage-grouse and sagebrush. It seems that most endangered and threatened species and many species of concern have very narrow habitat requirements or live in very specific kind of locations. And with sage-grouse and sagebrush, we have a lot more opportunities that also present challenges. For example, the species covers a huge range spanning all or parts of 11 states and 2 provinces. And many of the conditions across that range differ greatly, not only in terms of the disturbance that's there, but also in the form of the sagebrush and the dynamics and the resilience of the ecosystem. And so not only is this opportunity, but it's also a great deal of challenge. And just the very reasons why sage-grouse conservation is so challenging is because, first of all, their broad range-wide distribution. Second of all, then, the diversity of sagebrush environments across this entire range that includes, like I said, 11 parts of 11 states, and the complex dynamics that are within those sagebrush, different components of the sagebrush system itself. There are a wide variety of system stressors depending on where you go. There's livestock grazing throughout much of the area covered by sagebrush. There's also mining going on in many places, and now there's a more recent push for renewable energy in the form of wind energy and geothermal and solar energy that are also imposing different sorts of impacts and disturbances on the system. Compounding the problem is that these large ranges by sage-grouse include multiple land ownerships. And even though the majority of the area is managed by the public land agencies, oftentimes in many places we have a checkerboard mosaic of public and private land. With the large ranges covered by sage-grouse, then, it involves forming coalitions and different kinds of strategies that are going to include different land ownerships, different objectives for that land, and different kind of land uses. Not only that, but all sagebrush is not equal, and this may come as a surprise to some people who just casually drive across and look out there and see, oh, it's just sagebrush out there. But the reality is there are different kinds of sagebrush that live in different kinds of situations and have different responses to disturbance based on soils and different conditions, and this all has a factor in how we might manage these systems. So I just want to give you a kind of an idea, a snapshot of one location and of the sorts of things that we're up against. And the area I've chosen is in northeastern Wyoming. It's in the Powder River Basin. And the caption isn't meant to be flippant, but it's the reality in that in many cases we just simply cannot go back and reset the system. In that many of the impacts that are being imposed upon sagebrush right now are not the things that we are going to be able to remove in the future. And even if we could or somewhat reduce the level of development or the use, many of the components have changed such that there's no going back to some kind of situation like it was when the Euro-Americans first started settling this country in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So the reality is the future isn't what it used to be. And this is a sagebrush landscape, and it certainly is all of that. It's dominated by sagebrush, and it's used by sage-grouse and many of the other sagebrush obligate species. There's also some level of disturbance in there, and as we look out across the landscape, that level of disturbance certainly doesn't seem to be very much, but it has an impact on sage-grouse, and that impact can be in the form either of a direct impact, some kind of a behavioral response to that the sage-grouse have in their movements either on the breeding range or in the wintering range. For some reason, sage-grouse just tend to avoid tall structures on the horizon. They didn't grow up with them, and all of a sudden we're putting these structures on the horizon, so there's a behavioral avoidance. That's a direct effect. There's also an indirect effect in that much of the coal bed methane, the process to extract it involves pumping out some of the water. That water then is contained in pools surrounding each of these well situations, and the pools provide breeding areas for mosquitoes, which then carry West Nile virus. Sage-grouse are extremely susceptible to West Nile virus, and so you have both a direct effect as well as an indirect effect mediated through different pathways through the system. The bottom line is that even at low numbers of development in the system, there's a huge effect on the sage-grouse populations. And the one graph then shows you the relationship of sage-grouse populations, both inside gas fields and outside gas fields, showing you that even at relatively low levels of development, there is a large impact on the sage-grouse populations. But not only on the sage-grouse then, but the sagebrush. And it's, again, you have the direct effect on sagebrush of removing habitat for the well development as well as the road and the power line infrastructure. But there's also then an indirect effect caused by the disturbance alongside these roads that allows an exotic plant species, in this case a bromus or cheatgrass, to get in the system, having an indirect effect that's going to alter the fire regimes in that area, and over time can increase the level of fire, increase the amount of disturbance, and ultimately change the whole dynamic of the system. So in a very short series of slides here, I've managed to talk about not only direct and indirect effects, but also local and landscape and effects at different spatials and different temporal scales. These all factor into the ways in which we need to look at conserving sage-grouse and sagebrush systems and how we design our strategies for long-term conservation. And again, this isn't just an isolated incident, but rather these kind of effects are occurring in a different form virtually across the entire area that's currently occupied by greater sage-grouse. Most of this is happening on public land. Within the range occupied by sage-grouse then, approximately 70% of that area is managed by a public land agency, and in all about 50% of the area is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The black areas in this, which are the national parks, are really the only areas that are set aside that have some kind of a management or a protection from different land uses and different kind of human-caused disturbance. The reality is that parks cover less than 1% of the area occupied by sagebrush, and with the parks do a good job, as we say, of protecting rocks and ice, but we don't do a very good job of protecting sagebrush. What this means is that the future of sagebrush is going to be largely determined by public lands and a mix of public and private lands, and it's going to be managed for the different uses going on in those landscapes as well. My objectives today then in this presentation are first of all to illustrate the need of why we have to prioritize regions. And that may seem intuitively obvious. First, we simply don't have the resources that are necessary to do everything at once. But it helps me at least to be able to kind of visualize the resources we might have relative to the area that we might have to work with. Then I want to describe the organization of sagebrush systems. And the reason for that is because understanding this hierarchical nature of sagebrush can help focus how we look at our conservation strategies. In the level at which we might design conservation strategies, whether we're looking at a range-wide distribution, whether we're looking at a population level, whether we're looking at a landscape or an individual site within that landscape, we need to understand how that system operates. Finally then, I'll detail a strategy for conservation actions that is based on some work we've done for the last several years, and that involves some spatial modeling, not only to delineate sage-grouse distributions, but also then as a means to focus the restoration in areas where it will do the most good. Throughout then, I want to kind of mirror the theme that's been adopted by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and it developed through different focus groups as an overall strategy for what we should do for long-term conservation of sage-grouse. And it basically distills down to conserve what we have and to improve or restore what has been lost. So how do we do that? First of all, we need some way to prioritize the landscape and the system that we have. And to do that, I've chosen which was a Healthy Lands initiative, and this was an initiative that came out a few years back and never really got any traction. But I really liked it, and the reason I liked it for a number of reasons is one is that its focus was in the right place. The highest priority was to maintain sagebrush steppe habitat, followed by strategically restoring fragmented habitat. And as a result of doing that, then, it would conserve habitat for species such as sage-grouse, which depend on the communities, but it also emphasized the sagebrush communities that include up to 350 other species of wildlife that are dependent on these systems. And this strategy, or the initiative, also had some real dollars tied with it and a very definite area that could be treated in restoring and an area in which they wanted to focus. And I want to use that then to put into perspective just why we need to prioritize it and what we're up against. And so I'm switching a little bit of the areas and the statistics and things like that, but you'll get the idea. And I've also changed the area into a square just because that was easier for me to model. But the total area that we were talking about was something on the nature of 29 million hectares. Of that, and within that region, the Bureau of Land Management is responsible for about 62% of that area, which is roughly 18 million hectares. Within the area, about almost 9 million hectares is dominated by sagebrush. Of that, over half of the area is at either moderate or high risk to cheatgrass invasion. And in recent years, the area burned has amounted to about 506,000 hectares. And I think you can see where this is going. The area that would have been able to be treated under this Healthy Lands initiative was about 9,308 hectares. It was very small and relative to the entire area that we're dealing with. And so when we look at the real-world situation in which sagebrush is distributed across this area occupied by greater sage-grouse, and sagebrush again is different. We have different levels of sagebrush. We have different levels of fragmentation. The question I ask is, where are you going to put that little blue square? and why would you do it? And this is really a topic that has interested me a great deal, and I have the opportunity to, in many years, help with BLM restoration class. And at that class, we worked through a case study. And the case study is beautiful in that the students are given the opportunity to conduct one restoration project any place throughout the western United States. But they have to give a reason why they would conduct that restoration project and where they would do it. And that essentially forms the basis of what we're doing with our conservation strategies. And so to understand all of this then, we need to look at the way sagebrush and many ecological systems are organized. And if we look at it in terms of a hierarchical organization, at the local scale then, with very relatively short time dynamics and within relatively small spaces, we're looking at individual shrubs as well as individuals within a sage-grouse population. Most of our management doesn't happen at this level, and most of us aren't overly concerned when an individual sagebrush plant dies or an individual sage-grouse dies as well. But those shrubs collectively make up sites, or landscape terminology, they make up patches, habitat patches, and the individuals collectively make up a population. The sites then collectively make up a landscape, and the landscape then collectively makes up, group of landscape collectively make up ecoregions, and ultimately through the biome or the range-wide distribution of the species. And so understanding that these have interactions within different levels can help us try and focus then restoration at the appropriate level at which it's going to do the most good, but also understanding how it fits in the whole scheme of things. And if we look at sage-grouse, for instance, most of the things in which we're focused on are someplace larger than site level, but someplace less than landscapes. At those spatial and temporal dimensions, we're going to be focusing on certainly more than distributions of individuals, but maybe a bit less than what individual sage-grouse populations. The key then is to take these concepts, develop some kind of a strategy so that we aren't creating just a checkerboard of individual treatment areas or individual conservation areas, but rather one that works within this interaction of different hierarchical levels, such that ultimately by restoring or conserving individual stands and sites, we create functioning landscapes and ultimately have an impact on individual populations and ultimately on the zone and the sage-grouse distribution. So as part of this strategy then, some of the things that we've been working on are first of all to delineate sage-grouse distributions, and this fits into, what is it that we have and where are things located. So how do we delineate sage-grouse distributions and understand the spatial network of greater sage-grouse? The next component that I would talk about then would be ways to identify optimal areas for sagebrush conservation and restoration. What this means is that if we take the concept that all of these areas across the entire sagebrush range are not created equally, that there are some areas in which we can have a better return for our effort if we can focus on those areas as opposed to a fairly just hit or miss process of, okay, we're going to do some work here and hope that it works. I think there are ways that we can optimize the efforts that we do by focusing those efforts in the places that fit within a set of criteria. And finally then, a goal then to increase or maintain the connectivity of sage-grouse populations. And we'll get into a little bit of the metapopulation structure of sage-grouse as part of this first section. And with that then, I think we can help understand then why it is we need to focus in areas, in certain areas, to improve our chances not only of preserving the existing sage-grouse distribution, but also then to connect some of these isolated populations that may be in greater danger of local extinctions. And again, keeping within this overall strategy or concept of the highest priority to maintain what we have and to improve or restore what has been lost. So if we look at the range-wide distribution of greater sage-grouse, and this is really one of the maps that started the whole conservation process for greater sage-grouse, and it was developed by Mike Schroeder and published in the Condor in 2004. And what it shows is the light blue areas then are the historical distribution of sage-grouse based on the kind of habitat conditions, and it was developed from sighting records of the early explorers and a bunch of other kinds of records to outline this distribution. And it's probably the best map that we would have of knowing where sage-grouse were. And then the dark blue area is the current distribution of greater sage-grouse. A couple of things to notice. First of all, that if you were to do the statistics, the total area currently occupied by greater sage-grouse is about half, 56%, of the area that was once currently occupied by sage-grouse. The other thing is that the shrinkage hasn't been entirely even from the edge of the sage-grouse, the historical range, and that the shrinkage has been greater in some areas, and you can see that many of the smaller areas have started to be carved up and isolated. And in particular, we have the two populations in Washington, as well as an area on the border, straddling the border, populations between California and Nevada, Mono Lake populations. And there's genetic evidence that these have been isolated long enough now that those populations are distinct from the main core populations of the sage-grouse range. And so what we're looking at then is an uneven distribution of sage-grouse across the range, but also then some kind of structure within that population itself. If we then think about sage-grouse populations in terms of that hierarchical organization, we have not only the range-wide distribution then, but also smaller components or breeding populations. Within that then, these little leks, or not little dots, which are sage-grouse leks, are breeding locations for sage-grouse. Sage-grouse every spring congregate on these areas, the males, for breeding, and they go through a fairly elaborate display, and of course the whole purpose is to attract males and do some breeding. These leks have been monitored for many years, and in some cases as many as 80 years and longer, and every year then biologists go to these leks and count the sage-grouse that have been drumming and doing this display at the lek. From that then we have a fairly accurate estimate of not only how many grouse are at each of these little black dots, or the leks, but also then population trends over time at each of these areas. But we also get an idea then, looking at this map, that within the populations themselves are individual little breeding units, the leks themselves, and that we need a way to be able to describe how these populations are connected in order to focus management that's going to help us not only in areas where there are a lot of sage-grouse, and these leks are fairly closely aligned with each other, but also those spaces in between. And to do that then, we need to think of this whole distribution then in some kind of a meta-population structure. And if you go back to your kind of meta-population schooling back in college, and how metapopulations work, is basically a function of how large you are and how well you're connected to each other. And so if we think of those different populations as these different gray circles as the population units, and that it's important to have some kind of exchange among these individual populations. And that exchange then, through the form of dispersal then, allows for maintaining genetic diversity within the population, but also then in the event that some of these populations become extinct for whatever reason, then there is a recolonization through dispersal from adjacent populations. And so it becomes then a function of not only how big you are, but how well connected you are. And if some of these smaller populations then are wiped out for whatever reason, and you need to then have some kind of way to recolonize them or to recover them, and those areas then that don't have dispersal are ones that are simply lost. That means that what we need to focus on is not only the large balls then, but also those areas that connect these as well. And we need a means to be able to describe that as well. And so in work that Steve Hanser and I have done then in looking at this distribution of LECs, we've used principles of connectivity to map the distribution and this collection of LECs in a way that tells us, assign some kind of importance to not only LECs but the cluster of LECs that gives us some kind of an estimate then that's based on how big the LEC is and the groups of the LECs as well as the distance between the LECs themselves. And so we take this map that we had earlier, which was the individual populations, the little black dots that were LECs, and using kind of a fancy mathematical connect the dots, we come up with these kind of linkages then among the different constellations of the LECs within the sage-grouse network. And if we then group those into areas that are connected based on a certain distance that sage-grouse tend to disperse, we can map then kind of the breeding network of sage-grouse then across the entire range. These individual components then represent clusters or constellations of LECs that are connected to each other by a distribution, by a distance of within a dispersal distance of individual sage-grouse. So that initial large kind of range-wide distribution that you saw that was made even smaller in the dark blue area might in reality be even smaller than that and consist of a number of fairly large important kind of core regions dominated throughout the center of the sage-grouse range, but that the rest of the sage-grouse distribution is composed of fairly small clusters of LECs that have very little exchange with neighboring clusters. And if you look at then kind of the size and the area of these polygons or clusters, if you will, by and large, 90% of these breeding units consist of groups of LECs that are, or has a polygon that include less than 20 LECs. And the area within these constellations, again, is quite small. If you go back to kind of your metapopulation dynamics, one of the things that allows you to persist over time is to be large and relatively connected. And the reality within the sage-grouse distribution is that many of these components then are really quite small and may be relatively isolated from each other. The next part of what we've been doing then, in addition to delineating sage-grouse distributions, and just keep in mind we're going to put all these things together at the end, is then to identify optimal areas for sagebrush conservation and restoration. Sage-grouse, I haven't mentioned it yet, but I thought it was obvious that sage-grouse depend on sagebrush. And despite what some of the previous administration might have wanted you to believe, sage-grouse do depend on sagebrush. And although on the one hand it may be true that if you have sagebrush, you may not have sage-grouse. If you do not have sagebrush, you will not have sage-grouse. So it really becomes a matter then of identifying areas in which we can maintain and conserve the existing distribution of sagebrush, but also then to focus our restoration areas where we're really going to have the most success of restoring sagebrush, and to do it in those areas that meet a certain set of environmental conditions, as well as then ultimately can benefit sage-grouse. And so if we look at a couple of different kind of snapshots of sagebrush distribution across the entire sage-grouse range, and this is just a fancy GIS way of kind of depicting different views of sagebrush, kind of as if you were in an airplane flying at a relatively low level and then a higher level and then ultimately from space or something like that. And it gives you a little different idea of kind of how sagebrush might appear on the landscape with a different kind of connectivity and where the important regions are. And for instance, at the 5-kilometer panel, what we've mapped here is the amount of sagebrush within a 5-kilometer radius of each of the GIS cells in this GIS map. It gives you much more of the salt and pepper effect or the mosaic of individual sagebrush patches, as well as those areas that do not have sagebrush itself. As you move into the 18-kilometer range, which might be a perspective that sage-grouse have more in terms of the way they look at this landscape, you start to see a broader pattern of sagebrush appearing on the landscape. By the time you get up to a 50-kilometer distribution, and what you're really doing is mushing again this percent of sagebrush within the landscape into a larger and coarser resolution. You see some of these core areas of sagebrush showing up, and again at the 100-kilometer range you see again the core areas of sagebrush. Interesting that those core areas of the sagebrush also reflect pretty closely those core areas of the sage-grouse themselves. But again, this gives us a different perspective of sagebrush distribution, how species, individuals, and populations might respond, and at which spatial scale or resolution they might be responding to. And so one of the things we wanted to do in modeling where to optimize your restoration was to delineate, first of all, where were the large-scale distributions, in this case of Wyoming or basin big sagebrush distribution, but also within that the small-scale patterns of fragmentation. The rationale behind that was, if we're going to do a restoration, we don't want to do it in an area where there isn't any sagebrush already. It doesn't do us any good to put that little blue square out in the middle of a large area dominated by cheatgrass. You aren't going to really accomplish anything. You're not going to attract any of the sagebrush obligate species, and you're not improving the connectivity or the size of any of the individual sagebrush patches. On the other hand, if we can locate the places where we would like to do restoration near these large-scale, someplace within this large-scale sagebrush distribution, but locate it in those areas that have some kind of small-scale pattern of fragmentation. That way we can fit that little blue square within the areas that are in a large scale dominated by sagebrush. In other words, we can start filling in those spaces in between. We provide a connectivity then among the different sagebrush patches, and we can also use those larger scale patches of sagebrush to serve as seed sources and improve then the connectivity and eventually coalesce into a much more homogeneous patch of sagebrush across the landscape. So our rationale in this then was to, first of all, identify those areas in which there were the large-scale distributions, but also then to that had a small-scale pattern of fragmentation to fit our restoration project within that. And I apologize for switching around to a couple of different study areas, but this project was done for the western United States, and particularly in the area that at that time was bounded by the Great Basin Restoration Initiative. And so again, this shows you then the relative proportion of Wyoming and basin big sagebrush at a large-scale distribution. At the same time then, we mapped the amount of habitat edge as a way to look at the fragmentation and to identify those areas that had a relatively small scale pattern or fragmentation of sagebrush within this distribution. So we got these two things, and we've got them in a GIS map that we're going to use in a model in a little bit later on. The other thing is that we need to find places that are suitable for growing sagebrush. Again, there are optimal sets of environmental conditions for growing sagebrush, and it doesn't do us any good to try and focus our restoration in those areas that have soils that aren't going to benefit sagebrush, or low kinds of, or the kind of precipitation that isn't going to work. And so we can use these factors: soil conditions, precipitation, slope, elevation, to model optimal locations where we can grow sagebrush. The features that we used then were elevation, precipitation, the amount of water capacity within the soil depth to rock, soil depth, salinity, and pH. And we were able to put this in a statistical model then that allowed us then to optimize places where we would expect to grow sagebrush. And we used as a kind of the foundation and basis for that some of the existing sagebrush on the landscape right now. That allowed us to do is to model the landscape and say, hey, these are the places that we're going to have the best success based on environmental conditions. The third factor that we wanted to consider then was, what's the risk of cheatgrass displacement? As I mentioned earlier, about half of the area was in a moderate to high risk of cheatgrass displacement. It doesn't do us a lot of good to spend a lot of effort on a restoration or conservation action in a place that's ultimately going to be lost to cheatgrass and fire within the next couple of years, within the next decade, or within a time frame like that. So if we can avoid those kind of areas, that's certainly going to help us then and reduce a complication that's going to influence the success of our restoration. And so using a similar form of process that we used for modeling sagebrush, we developed a spatial map then of areas that were at high risk and differing risk to cheatgrass occupation. And these are areas that either currently have cheatgrass or, following disturbance, are highly likely to come back into an area dominated by cheatgrass. So we put all of this together in a spatial model. Like I say, these were GIS maps, and they're available on the Sage Map website if people want to download the individual GIS layers. And using then this spatial model, which is essentially a mathematical function of a way to fit the different layers together, we came up with priority regions, these little blue squares then, for much of the western United States, on where we could focus our restoration efforts and achieve a reasonable amount of success. As you can see, there's a lot of little blue squares still around the West, and areas in which we could focus our restoration. And this, again, is based on a different kind of percentile and things like that, and so we could further prioritize these into higher and higher priority sites based on a given set of priorities that we may choose, either based on different kind of variables that would need to be input, or different levels of the criteria, existing criteria that we put into it. But again, they give us a way of looking at this wide distribution and saying, here's where I think we can have the best success for focusing the efforts, not only to conserve what's already there, but then to focus the restoration areas themselves. And you can see in the inset, we've done a good job of avoiding those areas that are going to have a fairly high likelihood of cheatgrass coming into the area, and well as put it within areas of existing sage brush distribution and kind of fill in those spaces. The third part of that then is to kind of put these two components together in a way that increases or maintains the connectivity of sage-grouse populations. And so we'll go back to that original map that we had of the different breeding components, and again in the GIS overlay those high priority areas and show how this fits in a strategy very nicely in a way that we have the existing breeding areas of greater sage-grouse with those demarked in gray, in which we can focus conservation to maintain what we have. But those areas that we should focus on when we can do treatments, or if we need to, for instance, get into fire reduction or control fires, natural or human-caused fire outbreaks, things like that. These are areas that we could focus on, and that would allow us not only to then coalesce and start building some of those areas for sagebrush patches, but also start to increase the connectivity among these core areas of the sage-grouse distribution, but also then to create sagebrush that's going to be used as travel corridors among the different breeding units of sage-grouse themselves. And so then, just in conclusion, and following which then I think there's plenty of time for some questions, I just note that the available resources that we have simply do not permit us to do everything at once. And so there needs to be some form of prioritizing the regions for sagebrush and sage-grouse. How we prioritize that can be different in different kinds of regions. I've set up one kind of a model with different kind of conditions and priorities leading to different kind of priorities. We may in different regions have areas to model looking at planned disturbance or development, things like that, to look at how that development is going to influence these priority areas, how it might influence the existing sagebrush distribution and components. But again, the approach would be that we have different factors that we look at. We look at those factors in a way not only to look at the existing level of the distribution, but also then in terms of the organization of the system itself. Are we going to be influencing individuals? Are we going to be influencing sites themselves? Or are we actually at a point where we're going to influence populations and the population structure within the sage-grouse distribution? Spatial modeling is a very important tool that we can use. I've given some examples for that, not only for modeling the distribution of sage-grouse, but also then how to delineate sagebrush and to develop prioritizing those areas where we can focus future actions and conservation actions. And ultimately then I think that these kind of approaches do rest and fit well with this strategy that is based on conserving what we have and also give us the opportunity then to restore what has been lost. And so just before I take the questions then, I'd like to acknowledge the people that have supported myself as well as the projects that I've been working on, the U.S. Geological Survey, Idaho Department of Fish and Game, the Fish and Wildlife Service, in the Bureau of Land Management, Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is the individual state agencies responsible for managing the sage-grouse populations. A lot of the connectivity work has been focused in and encouraged through the Erica Fleischman, the Nevada CAD project, as well as then the Wilberforce Foundation. And of course I'd also like to acknowledge my longtime friend and colleague Jack Conley, who has worked with me in many different sage-grouse and sagebrush issues. So with that then, I've left a fair amount of time that I think we can have some questions, and I'll see if I'm able to answer them.
Thank you very much, Steve. I will now field questions for Steve. Before that, I wanted to address that two people emailed and said that their audio was dropping in and out, and I tried to look into that problem, and I'm not sure what was going on, so I'm very sorry if that was happening to you, and we'll have the video will be sent to us, and I can send the audio and video of this presentation to you, or the presentation itself. So let me know, please email me and let me know if you want me to send you the video directly, and I apologize for that. All right, so now if you have any questions for Steve, please type them in the question box and I will read them to Steve, and I'll do my best to pronounce your name correctly. Right now, Steve, do you want to start with a question from your live audience?
Live audience, do you have any questions? Okay, the question was, how would I cast the kind of recommendations I made in the prioritization and the modeling in terms of one of the conservation reserve design theories of having a single large area in which to focus efforts or having several smaller areas to interact with, and the relative success that might be achieved from these different kind of strategies. And I guess in thinking of this, my original focus would be on some of these large areas initially, because these are predicted in the long term, both with the climate change effects and things, other land development things, to have the most stability, and we need to retain those over the long term. And then as a lower priority, try and include some of these smaller populations that already are at risk. But the reality is that some of the factors that are influencing these small populations are ones that we're not going to have much influence on, whether it's a land use development, whether there's some kind of an isolation by distance already, but that within some of these smaller areas, we may not be as successful as conserving some of these large areas. Having said that, there's an intermediate area as well, that if we can get enough of these clusters within a fairly consolidated area, that we can focus some of the effort and maximize a number of these groups and essentially create a large area. I think that would work as well. But again, conserving what we have is the main priority, and that's going to be these larger areas.
Okay, thank you very much. Now a question from the webinar audience. Dexter Dong asked, what is the SageMap website that you said we could get data from?
The question is, what is the SageMap website that I said you could get data from? And it's a USGS sponsored website, and it's on the web, and if I remember the web address right, it's http sagemap.wr.usgs.gov. And you can also just do a Google search on SageMap, and there are actually two SageMap programs. One is for genetics, and you don't want that one. But the other one is the sagebrush and grassland ecosystem site. There are a lot of things on that site, including many data layers that are free for download, as well as many documents that you can download. The book that Jack Conley and I have edited and coming out as a Studies in Avian Biology, until that book appears in print in the next couple of months, you can download pre-publication chapters of each of those for the book itself and get the data for many of those chapters as well. So it's a tremendous resource. It was originally sponsored by the Bureau of Land Management, and now is maintained by the U.S. Geological Survey.
Thanks. Do you want to go with a question from your group?
Yes, we have a question in our group.
Okay.
The question kind of was a variant of, when is a white horse become a black horse, and how do you measure those grades of white and black in between, and what level of fragmentation, is it a mosaic, and what level is it fragmented? And the answer to that is not a simple one, because we use simply in measuring what we did as a measure of edge of sagebrush versus non-sagebrush. And all edge is not created equally. You can have sagebrush that's next to, for instance, a grassland. That's not nearly as harsh an edge as an area of sagebrush that might be next to a riparian area or a urban development or something like that. So there are different grades of edge. Different species perceive that edge differently as well. And for instance, sage-grouse probably perceive fragmentation much differently than does a brewer sparrow. A brewer sparrow may look at the collection of sagebrush itself and see fragmentation essentially is within the individual shrubs. Sage-grouse absorb that edge of the individual patches within their annual range, but if the distribution of sagebrush within their annual range is separated by 20 to 40 kilometers, they're not likely to cross it. So the way we treated sagebrush edge was at kind of that intermediate level for sage grouse at the 18-kilometer resolution, and looking at if you had patches within that but no sagebrush within that, that kind of defined the level of sagebrush and the patches that were in there for fragmentation. What that level allowed us to do then is look at, for instance, we can have sagebrush fragmentation at a level, for instance, in parts of northeastern Nevada, parts of southern Idaho, and eastern Idaho, as having a level of fragmentation but still sage-grouse. But for instance, that level of fragmentation is too great if you try and cross the Snake River Plain. And those populations are essentially isolated.
Thank you. All right, I have a question from Chris Cromwell. What are the methods you propose to conserve? What are the methods you propose to conserve areas of optimal habitat, especially from fire?
So the question is, what are the methods that I would propose to conserve optimal areas of sagebrush from fire? And that's a very difficult one because fire is a natural part of this system and always has been. The problem right now is that the incidence of fire is either too great in many areas that have been taken over by cheatgrass, or the incidence of fire is too rare in some of the higher elevation areas currently experiencing woodland encroachment into these areas. So we have essentially two different situations, one in which there is too much fire, one in which there isn't enough fire. The conundrum is, how do we conserve these areas, still let fire be a part of the system, but not one in which it's devastating itself? And in many cases, I have to admit I don't know the answer, because cheatgrass has infiltrated many of these areas and is going to make it difficult to suppress fires once they get going in there. There's a push in many cases to kind of break up the larger patches of sagebrush and create fire breaks. I'm not really in favor of that, because many times the disturbance, at least in the areas we've done that in the past, has not resulted in a very good set of native plants that have come into that area. Instead have been taken over by cheatgrass or other exotics, and it hasn't had the kind of desired effect. Really the best thing we can try and do now is try and manage for systems that have a good overstory of sagebrush with an understory of native perennial grasses and forbs, and try and use fire suppression as best we can within many of those areas, and try and reduce the size of fire within those areas as best we can.
Thank you. Okay, your turn.
Yes. The question is, how do you build flexibility into these kind of prioritized models that we have, and what kind of factors do we need to include, and how do we weight those different factors in a new kind of evaluation of where we might prioritize areas? The models that we've used are multivariate models ultimately, and even though the individual models have different inputs into them, they can be rearranged and new factors added ultimately into a new system. Ultimately, what you get in the output is some probability of success, or a probability of growing sagebrush, or a probability of maintaining the system. And so You can include new factors, whether it would be the human footprint, for instance, as a disturbance, a development factor within that, and the challenge for that is then to give it some kind of a numerical value that tells you, is this a total effect, is it a kind of an indirect effect, is it a partial effect, and how does that factor weight in among the other variables in your system. And to give an example of that, if you have kind of a fragmented area that you're working on and you want to site a power line through that, the effect of that area is probably not going to be as great in an already fragmented area as if you're putting it in a previously undisturbed sagebrush area. How do you weight those different kinds of factors? And that's where a lot of the work we're doing right now is going at, and trying to estimate the area effect, the different kind of habitat relationships that are surrounding that effect, and the time lags, as well as then the spatial distribution of that decay function or effect away from that. So we've gone the first step of being able to look at different factors and knowing which ones we'd like to include, whether it's development, whether it's climate change. The next step is to incorporate those ultimately into the model, which we can do in a mathematical sense, and regenerate the different priorities.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have a question from, and this is embarrassing, I have a French name and don't speak French, so I hope I say your name right, Louis, but it's from Louis Provencher, and he asks, you said that Wyoming sage and basin big sage will be used for the distribution model. Why not include mountain sage that is heavily used by grouse in Nevada, sometimes more than Wyoming sage?
Okay, the question was, my models showed only Wyoming and basin big sage, and yet sage-grouse, particularly in Nevada and in other areas, use mountain big sage as well. And the final model actually did include mountain big sagebrush as well. I showed the initial delineation for Wyoming big sagebrush and basin big sagebrush, but in the paper that Kara Meinke wrote, we did it both for Wyoming and basin big sage, and then for mountain big sagebrush as well. And then in the results I showed today with the blue squares, that was combining the results both for basin, mountain big sage, and Wyoming big sage. So they all were included in the final model that I showed.
Okay, great, thanks. Do you have another question over there?
Yes. The first question is, how much area needs to be restored to meet population goals? I don't know the answer to that, because populations range over different sizes and can be up to 2,700 square kilometers. If you're doing a restoration or a treatment in a critical area, for instance in a wintering area, you can have a fairly big effect on that population itself as opposed to other areas within that annual range. The problem with sage-grouse is that they use different seasonal ranges that don't necessarily overlap. So the size of that can vary not only by the seasonal range, but also then the relative importance of that seasonal area as well. So I didn't answer that question. The next question was, remind me again? Oh. How adequate are our current restoration techniques? And I would say that our current restoration techniques tend to be the most successful in those areas that haven't been heavily disturbed, that have the native community already in place. And in other words, we have the shortest distance to go to get from the place that's disturbed to the place we want to get to. And so the places where restoration has been successful have been in some of the areas with favorable precipitation, good soils, a good community of native understory to begin with. The areas where restoration doesn't succeed very well are in these low precipitation areas where there's already exotic plants like cheatgrass, so we need to work on controlling them and have a much more massive investment in getting the site prepared to restore sagebrush.
Great, thank you. We have a question now from Karen Blakeme. You have delineated several areas, e.g. Great Basin East and West. Are you suggesting prioritization within each of these sub-areas or among all areas?
The question is, since we delineated the sage-grouse distribution between a kind of an eastern and a western range, how would we prioritize among the eastern and western, and would we do it within the individual areas, and how far would we break it down essentially? The sage-grouse range right now, and management of sage-grouse within the entire range-wide distribution is really split into 7 management zones that have been delineated by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And those zones then are based on similarities of environment as well as then relative connectivity of sage-grouse populations within those zones. So not only east and west, but they're also then individual management zones. The way the prioritization models are set up is you could prioritize across the entire species range. You could do it east and west. You could also develop a prioritization within individual management zones as well. And I mean, ultimately, you could also do it within BLM states or within field offices within states and things like that. And so essentially, if you look at a national prioritization, and then you can break it down within that where you might want to focus efforts, but you can do the prioritization at different levels.
Thank you. Okay, we have a bunch of questions still more on this end. Do you have more questions over there?
Yes. The question is, we've seen how populations decline, how nesting success declines, and we lose individuals as a result of different activities, whether it's development or infrastructure, things like that. Do we have any good information on how much we can gain by restoring or focusing on improving areas where there's already existing sage-grouse populations? And unfortunately, I don't know that we have the answer to that. And that's a really critical answer. And the reason being is that we look at, you know, right now there's a large push to mitigate conservation efforts, particularly in regard to energy development. If we lose this much area due to energy development, are there places that we can improve or restore and expect to see a similar or offset kind of what we've lost in those development areas? And I don't know that we have very good information on the increase in sage-grouse populations as a result of this restoration. There's a couple of things that complicate it. First of all, lag periods in population response. And on the one hand, sage-grouse are kind of weird in that they almost respond immediately to disturbance with some lag period. Their ability to respond to restoration or to areas that we create is really slow. And even areas that have come back in sagebrush in some places like in Oregon, after 20 years now, even though the characteristics are there, sage-grouse do not use those areas. So there are species that disturbance hits them hard. The response may not be as immediate and may be more difficult to quantify, and that's really something that's important, again, as we look at some of the mitigation in the future, how we quantify what we've lost and where we can regain it elsewhere. And I can assure you, though, it's not going to be a one-for-one. It's not that because things aren't created equally, if we wipe out this area of good sagebrush habitat or sage-grouse population, we can't expect an equal response to someplace else.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Stephen Beekadam. Have the effects of climate change been considered in your modeling process? Can you comment on the effects of increased fire and drought on your priorities?
Just a minute. Could you repeat that again?
Sure. Have the effects of climate change been considered in your modeling process? Can you comment on the effects of increased fire and drought on your priorities?
The effects of climate change have been quantified, and I can tell you that none of the predictions under any of the climate change scenarios are going to be good for sagebrush or sage-grouse. The long-term effects of climate change, if the full impact of, I think, 6 degrees centigrade by the end of this century are expressed, approximately 20% of the existing sagebrush distribution would remain. And that's because we would have increased amount of fire, we would have facilitate cheatgrass expansion, and we would also then have encroachment or distribution of shrubs from the Mojave and southern regions coming into area currently occupied by sagebrush. On the northern extreme, in the upper elevations then, we aren't going to see a similar kind of expansion of sagebrush because that area already is taken over by agriculture or by a different kind of woodland or something, so we aren't going to see as much expansion on the sagebrush end. So again, the effects of climate change, if they're fully expressed, are not going to be good, particularly because of the increased fire, the facilitation of cheatgrass, and just a whole host of factors that contribute to nothing good for sagebrush. Okay, we have a question from in here then.
Great.
So the question is kind of a follow-up then to the question on mitigation and how do we decide then what to conserve and what to restore, given that we might have unequal effects of restoration in response to the variables. One of the ways that we could do that then is, if we can't do it on a one-for-one basis, rather look at how we improve the stability of the long-term system, both in terms of providing a larger area of sagebrush, increasing the number of leks within that sage-grouse population, and increasing population size that ultimately contributes stability. So we may not be looking at necessarily the numbers of sage-grouse that we would increase, but rather improving stability by having a larger area to restore. To do that, then, the kinds of places we might select would be, again, along the edges, the existing edges of the current areas where we have the larger populations of sage-grouse, and to connect some of the more isolated ones to that core area.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer Mata asks, this question is from the Eagle Lake Field Office. What would happen to the treatment model if sage-grouse are listed?
What would happen to the treatment model if sage-grouse are listed? Can I ask for clarification on that?
Sure, Jennifer, if you don't mind typing in some more details, and unfortunately I'll have to scroll to the bottom, so I'll ask another question and then come back to that. Tracy Allen asks, what should the priority be for states such as Utah, which does not have much high priority areas identified?
What should the priority for Utah be, which does not have a lot of high priority area listed? There are populations of sage-grouse within Utah. Another priority that is not taken within these models are what you have for the Gunnison sage-grouse in the eastern part of the state of Utah. And so the priorities then to me would be to focus on the Gunnison sage-grouse, as well as in some of those sage-grouse areas like in south central Utah, where you do have a fair number of sage-grouse remaining, and to be able to improve conditions down in that region.
Thanks. Do you have more questions from your group, Steve?
No, I don't.
Okay, we have more over here. So another question from Louis. Does your cheatgrass map include areas with less than 10% cover of cheatgrass mixed in with shrubs? Land Landsat imagery does not pick up less than 10% without serious ground verification?
The question is, does the map of the cheatgrass distribution include areas in which there's less than a cheatgrass abundance mixed in with sagebrush? And the answer is yes, it does. And we developed these predictive maps separately. In other words, we developed the cheatgrass model based solely on environmental conditions, and so it can be overlaid with the existing sagebrush distribution. It's true that Landsat or any of the other satellite formats doesn't readily allow you to pick out understories of sagebrush distribution. But again, our model of cheatgrass distribution I think would overlay quite well with the sagebrush in providing an estimate of what the understory might be within the existing sagebrush area.
Okay, thanks. Getting back to Jennifer Mata's question, the model that you are using to predict priority areas might be changed by mandated priority areas critical habitat by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Could the model be changed to account for that? This is in clarification the listing question.
Yeah. The question is, if sage-grouse were listed, how would that, and certain priority areas were then mandated, how would that change the kind of model that we have or the depiction of the different areas for restoration? And certainly, there are other areas then that, and other criteria that may factor into it, and those would be either political or administrative decisions on where we might want to focus restoration. Our model at this point was based almost exclusively on environmental variables as well as the sage-grouse distribution. Having said that, I think that even if certain areas were politically mandated that these are places in which we need to conduct restoration, or these are areas we need to focus our conservation, I think that within that we could certainly adapt this kind of a modeling approach to look at the areas within that, again, as a large enough region in which we might do the actions either as conservation or restoration. So it could be readily adapted. If sage-grouse were listed and areas were mandated, that becomes a different variable and a different driving factor into where and why we do the treatments.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions. Next, Larry Zuckerman asks, is there a danger of setting up a triage situation where those areas not in priority areas are allowed to further decline or be wiped out by human impacts? If so, might lose some of the important genetic resources found near the fringes of the imperiled sage-grasses range, might be shortchanging their chance for recovery by concentrating on the central core areas.
The question is if there's a danger of a triage approach in which we essentially write off some of these smaller isolated populations of sage-grouse, and we may lose some of the genetic components and the diversity that's inherent within those populations that could be very valuable in terms of the greater distribution. Yes, there is a danger of that, in a very large danger. One of the things we're looking at doing is trying to get an estimate for just how much genetic diversity is in these smaller isolated populations. Some of the earlier analysis by Sarah Euler-McCants indicates that there is sufficient genetic diversity at the range-wide distribution, with the exception of the Washington population and the Mono Lake population straddling Nevada and California. But the rest of these areas at a range-wide scale apparently contain relatively the same genetic information. We're looking at using a much finer level of genetic information to determine just how much diversity is contained within these isolated populations. If we can couple that with different dispersal models, we can ultimately come up with an estimate of what we lose by essentially writing off some of these more isolated, smaller populations at the fringe. And that would provide us a good answer to your question about the danger of losing those populations. And the reality is, yes, we would lose something by that.
Thank you. As a follow-up, Larry asked if you could provide the link for the online chapter for your future Knick and Connolly book.
The online chapters right now are on that SageMap site that I mentioned earlier. It's, I think, on the front page. It just says go to the book or something. It's pretty clear where it is. Otherwise, the book is going to be published, and you can find it either through a link at the Cooper Ornithological Society, the Studies in Avian Biology series volumes, or it's being published by the University of California Press, and it's also on their site.
Thank you. As again, another follow-up to that, the question earlier, he asked about losing genetic diversity on the fringes, particularly relating to surviving climate change. I'm not sure if you answered that already.
Well, okay. The problem with climate change is that most of the areas that are predicted to be lost under climate change are those small populations as well. And so some of the remaining core areas of sagebrush are going to be only in the areas that have currently supporting some of the larger populations of sage-grouse. So under the climate change models, yes, those small areas of sage-grouse populations are predicted to be lost with the shifting distributions.
Okay, thanks. The last question is from Joanne Loudon. Are the results of the model identifying priority restoration areas available as a shapefile?
Yes, they are. And the various metadata, we're actually it's on my list of things to do, but it should be available. And the approach itself is in the paper by Kara Meinke that appeared in Restoration Ecology in 2009. But the base layers, as well as the restoration models themselves, will be available on the SageMap site.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was the last question here. Do you have any more questions over there?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Well, if anyone comes up with questions later, feel free to email me or Steve, and we'll do our best to get back to you in a timely manner. Thank you very much for your presentation today, Steve. We really appreciate it, and thank you all for your participation. All right.
Thank you, and goodbye.
All right, thanks. Have a good day, everyone.